Hello everyone and welcome back. In a recent video, we went over how we could get input from the user. Specifically, we were prompting for a favorite number. We were reading in that number as a string with the input built-in function, as you can see on line 80. And then we were converting that string to an integer, as you can see on line 88. We converted our string to an integer so that we could do some arithmetic with it, such as doubling the favorite number as an integer. What I'd like to do in this video now is go over our next new Python topic, which is conditionals. When I write conditionals, I am referring to pretty much if statements in Python, because unlike most other languages like C++ or Java, Python does not have a switch statement. So really our bread and butter for conditionals in Python are if statements. So what is an if statement? An if statement essentially allows us to conditionally execute some code. If some condition, which being formal here, the condition is typically called a Boolean condition because it evaluates to true or false, and a Boolean is true or false. So if some condition is true, then execute some code. Now, the syntax or the structure for a conditional in this form in Python is like this. If Boolean condition, colon, enter, and then tab, so 4 spaces or a tab, and then some body. In Python, we use indentation in order to denote that lines of code belong to a body of, say, a conditional or a loop or a function or a class. This would be similar to curly brackets in another language such as C++ or Java. So let's see a little example. Let's say I have a variable x and it stores the value 6. Let's say if x stores the value 6, I want to print out the string x is 6. So I'm going to test for equality. If x equals 6, this is my Boolean condition right here. Note that I'm using two equal signs, which together form equality. Does x store the value 6, true or false, as opposed to a single equal sign, which represents the assignment operator, in which case we're storing something in a variable. I've got my colon, and now I press enter. VS Code automatically tabs over 4 spaces, you can see, because I've got to provide a body for my if statement. If I don't want to provide a body, I still at least would have to write pass, which denotes a placeholder for essentially doing nothing. But I want to do something. If x is 6, I want to print out x is 6. Simple as that. So let's run it. I see x is 6, makes sense. X does store 6. 6 is equal to 6, true. So we enter the body of the if statement and line 101 executes, which is print x is 6. Now let's say I change x from 6 to 7. Now x equal to 6, does 7 equal 6 is false, and we will not see x is 6. And we don't. So far so good. Let's take a little bit more notes about the body of our if statement here. I can have more than one line indented to form a body. So let's put some comments in here. In Python, indentation is 1 tab or 4 spaces typically, but this is something that you can change in your editor. For example, in VS Code, if you look down towards the bottom right of my status bar, I can select indentation. By default, it is set to 4 spaces. So indentation is used in Python to group code statements into a block. And this is like the curly brackets if you're coming from a language such as C++ or Java. So I could put another statement in here that's executable, like hello, change x back to 6 and run this. And there I see x is 6 and hello. Everything that's indented after this if statement belongs to the body of it, and the body only executes when the Boolean condition on the preceding if statement is true. There are a few more topics related to if statements that I want to cover, including the else clause, which is essentially a body of code that executes when the Boolean condition on the preceding if statement is false. So essentially what to do when your if statement is not true. Also elif, which is short for else if. We see elif when working with what are called multiple alternative if statements. And then also nesting. We could put if statements inside of if statements, inside of else statements, inside of if statements, inside of elif statements, etc. Remember, every time we nest a structure like an if statement, we have to indent. So the indentation can get kind of crazy when you do that. I'd like to introduce these additional topics, else and elif and nesting, by going through a fun little example. So let's say we want to create a guess my number game. The idea is we have some secret number to guess. So I'm gonna have a variable called num to guess, and let's say the secret number is 4. Now I'm going to prompt the user to guess a number between 1 and 10 inclusive. And I'm gonna let them know whether they guessed my secret number correctly or not. So let's have a print statement here and say, please enter a number between 1 and 10 inclusive. And then I'm gonna grab the player's guess, which should be an integer. I'm also gonna note that previously we used a print statement and an input statement separately in order to prompt the user and get their value right here. If you want, you can actually collapse these two lines together because the input built-in function, it actually accepts a string, which is the prompt to show the user. So if you want to write a little bit shorter code, you could do this. And while I'm at it, I'm going to comment out all of this code up here prompting for the user's favorite number because I don't want to have to enter that in each time I test my guess my number game. All right, so let's print this out. Please enter a number between 1 and 10 inclusive, and let's say enter in 5. So the goal is to test if the player's guess is equal to the number to guess. If it is, then I conditionally want to execute a congratulatory message to the user to say, hey, you guessed the number. So let's try it out. So if the player's guess is equal to the number to guess, then I'm going to print out, congrats, you guessed the number. So let's try it. If I guess 4, it says congrats, you guessed the number. That's the secret number. But if I guess 5, I don't see congrats, you guessed the number. So in the case where the user guesses incorrectly, I'm going to add an else. And an else statement has to be preceded by an if statement because it's essentially attached to the if statement. And the else block only executes when the if Boolean condition is false. So I'm going to have an else block here where I say something along the lines of, unfortunately, you guessed the number incorrectly. So let's try this. I'm going to guess 5. And now I see, unfortunately, you guessed incorrectly. So that's cool. We're giving the user a little bit more feedback about their guess. So let's take a little bit of notes on else statements. We can use an else keyword by attaching it to a preceding if statement. Else bodies, so that would be what's indented after the else, only execute when the condition on the associated if statement is false. So what I like to do when first learning conditionals is put a one-line comment on my else, which is essentially the complement of the preceding if statements, Boolean conditions, so that I know what condition will get me to the else. So if I were to write this using Python operators, this would be not player's guess is equal to num to guess, which written another way is player's guess is not equal to num to guess. Essentially, the only way to get to line 115 is if player's guess equal to num to guess is false. And this exclamation mark can be read as not. So we'll write this one more way. Player's guess equal to num to guess is false. So hopefully one of those writings is very clear and makes sense. So that's how we get here. Now let's say in our else block, we want to give the user a hint to help them get a little bit closer to guessing the correct number. So I'm going to adapt my print statement in my else body here to say, unfortunately, you guessed incorrectly. However, I will give you a hint. This is going to be a great example of a nested if statement. So I'm still indented as part of the body of the else block. I'm going to have an if statement, and I'm going to test if player's guess is greater than num to guess. If it is, then I'm going to print your guess was too high. If this isn't true, I'm going to have an else, and here I'm going to say your guess was too low. So once again, let's put a comment on the else block here. So the only way to get to this else block is if the preceding if statement is false. So not player's guess greater than num to guess. Which means that player's guess is less than or equal to num to guess. But I know that this is actually strictly less than, because if player's guess was equal to num to guess, I never would have ended up in this else block here to begin with, because the Boolean condition on line 113 would have evaluated to true. So I know right here that player's guess is strictly less than num to guess. Their guess was too low. Let's try it. So let's go too high. Let's do 7. Okay, it says your guess was too high. And now let's go too low, like 2. And now it says your guess was too low. So that's a fun example of getting started working with nested if statements. So remember, every time you nest something, you're going to increase your indentation level. So just keep that in mind, because oftentimes a little more flatter hierarchy can be better, so that you don't start having these crazy nested structures that are really difficult to read. To help you kind of flatten your nesting, take a look at some additional Boolean operators in Python. If you're coming from another programming language, you might be used to logical AND. So in Python, this operator is the AND keyword. Double pipe in other programming languages is logical OR. In Python, this is the OR keyword. And then I've already mentioned and used the exclamation mark to represent logical not or negation. So this is the not keyword in Python. So if you type these, you'll see that they'll change to a different color in VS Code. This is how you would use these logical compound operators if you wanted to start building these compound Boolean conditions. Like maybe I could have something like if player's guess is greater than num to guess and something else. You could link those Boolean conditions using the AND keyword. All right, let's now talk about multiple alternative if statements. This is kind of a mouthful, but really what I'm referring to here is the use of the elif keyword. So we also have an elif, which is short for else if. So when would you use elif? Use elif when you want to test multiple conditions in order. The first condition that evaluates to true will have its body execute. Then at the end of that body, the code will exit the entire multiple alternative if structure. This is probably best seen with an example. And we can actually rewrite our code that was nested on lines 113 to 120 as our example. So I'm going to copy this and paste it. And what I can do is I can actually collapse this else and this if into an elif just like this. I'm going to lose that intermediate statement where I tell the user that they guessed incorrectly, no matter if they were high or low, but maybe that's okay. So let's comment out this previous structure here so we can test our new one. So if player's guess is equal to num guess, we'll still enter the body of the first if statement and print congrats, you guessed the number. If this evaluates to false, then Python will move down to our next Boolean condition and test to see if this is true. So we only get here if player's guess is not equal to num to guess. And now we've got to figure out, well, is the player guess too high? If this evaluates to true, then we'll enter the body of line 134, which is the print statement, your guess was too high, and then we'll exit out of the structure. If this is also false, then we'll drop down to the else, which is essentially a catch-all. What I mean by this is the else will always execute if none of the previous conditions are true. So if we're false and false, then else will always execute. And remember, once one of these conditions evaluates to true, the body executes. At the end of the body, then control flow essentially exits the entire if structure and nothing else will execute. So let me try saying that one more time, a little more clearly. Let's say that player's guess is 4. So this will evaluate to true. The body of the if statement will execute. Once the body is done executing, then it's going to skip over the entire rest of the multiple alternative if structure and move to the first executable line of code outside of the multiple alternative if structure. Let's run it and try it. So let's say I enter in 4. I see congrats, you guessed the number. Let's say I enter in 5. I see your guess was too high. And let's say I enter in 3. I see your guess was too low. So that's awesome. We've taken our nested if structure and we've flattened it down a bit using an elif, which is short for else if. As one more little bonus in this video, I'd like to show you a demo of how you can use these operators here. Specifically, we'll take a look at how we can use the AND operator. Now let's see how we could add some additional functionality to our game where, in addition to giving the user a hint about whether the guess is too high or low, we only give them 3 chances in order to guess correctly. So I'm going to declare a new variable called numGuesses, initializing it to 3. And every time the user makes a guess, I'm going to subtract 1 from numGuesses. So let's move numGuesses up to where we're first initializing the state of our game right here. Now, after we have told the user if they guessed the number correctly or if they're wrong, if their guess was too high or too low, I'm going to subtract 1 from numGuesses. I only have to do something with numGuesses if the user guesses incorrectly. So I could add some logic to our multiple alternative if statement, but I want to show you how to use the AND logical operator to make a compound Boolean condition. So just for the sake of this demo, I'm going to do it here after the multiple alternative if statement. What I'll do is I'll say if the player's guess is not equal to the num to guess, meaning they got their guess wrong, and if they still have some number of guesses left, then I'm going to print out, you get to try again. If they guess correctly, there's no point in checking the number of guesses because they're not going to try again. But if they guess incorrectly, then I've got to see, do they get a chance to guess again? So what I have here is a nested if statement, but I could rewrite this nested if statement more succinctly using a compound Boolean condition. So let me take some notes here to describe what we're about to do. The above nested if can collapse into a compound Boolean condition. So I could do if player's guess is not equal to num to guess, and so here's that logical and keyword here, num guesses is greater than 0, then I'll put my print statement in here. So lines 144 through 146 execute with the same behavior as lines 149 to 150, but 149 and 150 is a little cleaner and a little shorter and gives you a chance to see in action the and logical operator. We covered a lot of ground in this video with conditionals. We saw if statements with else's attached to them. We saw nesting of if statements inside the bodies of other if statements or else statements. And we also saw multiple alternative if statements that used elif. At the very end here, I showed you a quick little demo of how you could use a logical operator, namely the and keyword, in order to make a compound condition. Stay tuned for a future video where we're going to finish our guess my number game such that the user really does get to make multiple guesses. We'll need looping structures in order to do this because we don't know in advance how many times we need to prompt the user for their guess. They might maybe make the guess correctly on their first guess, or it might take all 3 guesses. Or maybe we want to change 3 to 5 because we're going to expand our number range from 1 to 20 instead of 1 to 10. So lots of functionality that we can add here. Stay tuned. Hopefully you learned a lot about conditionals in Python, and consider subscribing to my channel to learn more about Python programming. Thanks for watching.